We met on a seminar. You were teaching a seminar in the early 90s, and you were one of the first people in the industry to talk about downspouts and water draining off the house and how that could actually wind up in a crawl space.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Huge issue.
Now, we have some pictures here to go with our discussion. Let's start there in terms of when you're a home inspector, termite inspector,
And swimming pool inspector.
and swimming pool. You also can inspect the roofs and chimneys. So you
Yes.
you know your business. Let's speak about, this is near and dear to our hearts, the crawl space, the most forgotten part of a home. All right. So we start from the outside. When you are walking up the walkway, you noticed it is an uneven walkway.
Yeah, so oftentimes our first approach to the home is from the street. So we'll look at the walkway, the driveway, the lay of the land is if it's draining towards the property or properly draining away from the property. We'll get a good sense of what might be happening with the home after we've done the evaluation of the exterior.
Okay, let's say that you're walking up the home, and we might have a picture here to go with that, and you notice that the walkway is cracked.
Sometimes the cities will be responsible for maintaining the sidewalks, and they may, over time, have issues with tree roots or expansive soil conditions, but they'll go and ground down those surfaces so that they're not trip hazards. That'd be a real good telltale sign of potential distress in the soil around the home.
Now that same issue is, again, we might have a picture for this one, is when there's uneven walkways or cracked walkways.
Yeah, either conditions are potential trip hazards that we would cite as a home inspector, but then we want to look at the underlying cause and see whether we have adjacent trees that might be causing the swelling of the ground,
Okay.
or whether we have moisture conditions that are contributing to the lifting and cracking of the sidewalk.
Now we often see driveways, so we're walking past the sidewalk, we're walking up the driveway is cracked.
Yeah, so oftentimes those thin layers of concrete are only a few inches thick, and if you drive a big truck over it or something, you're going to cause cracks. But generally those cracks are going to be noted as a cause of perhaps moving vans or something like that. But if you have lifting, heaving cracks that become trip hazards greater than 3/8 of an inch that a woman might get her high heel in, we'll certainly cite those and again look for causes as to what might have been the result of that.
Now that's also in terms of the expanding. You talked about that in the seminar where the ground gets wet, soaking wet, and will expand and contract. So it gets wet in winter, contracts in summer.
Yeah, throughout the valley we have a very expansive soil, and that expansive soil will probably result in movement of the soil and the things that are in or on the soil by as much as 20%. So you're looking at intermittent exposure to moisture, causing the soil when it gets wet to expand 20%, and then will shrink when it dries out during the summertime.
Okay, so we walk up let's say it's a curved driveway, now we go into the garage, the slab floor of the garage, that is cracked. How did that happen?
So oftentimes a concrete slab is either a monolithic pour or it's independent from the perimeter foundation. So we'll look at a slab that isn't part of the foundation, it's poured separately. Let's talk about that one first. And what happens is that if the soil underneath the home is subjected to moisture, then it begins to swell and will crack down the center. And again, pictures that we have would indicate the conditions of excessive moisture. We start looking at the cause of that moisture, and we often identify either the ground sloping towards the home, or we have high water table, or we have downspouts that terminate next to the foundation.
And we have lawns that will go right up to the garage and a lot of vegetation, overwatering.
And sometimes we have, unfortunately, these beautiful brick earth-filled planters right up against the home.
Oh, that's right.
And
Okay,
we have faulty grades.
so now we walk out of the garage, we start in you could go left or right, and there's typically a downspout from the gutters, right?
That's correct.
The roof system, to the gutters. They collect the rain, massive amount of water, even in light rains, and that's dumped right next to the garage.
Yeah, unfortunately, as a minimum standard, we would hope that there would be a downspout catch pan or effluent pipe connected to that downspout. A minimum would be just a pan to divert the water so that it doesn't erode the soil and enter the ground right next to the foundation.
Okay. So now let's say you're on a typical home inspection. We met last week at one of my listings, and you put on the gear. Looks like a miner.
Yes.
Going down. You go into the crawl space. Now, by the way, that the customers, sellers, buyers need to clear out the hall closet,
That's
right?
correct.
And make sure that you have access to go into the access hatch, go underneath the house. And now we are now in the crawl space, and we have some pictures for this. So let's say you get down there and you look across. Your flashlight is right on the wall of the crawl space, the perimeter.
Sure.
And there looks like some material on the wall. What is that called?
It's called efflorescence, and it's basically mineral deposits that accumulate after moisture has evaporated from the surface of the concrete, leaving behind the minerals.
I see. So again, when we say crawl space, and you've crawled underneath, you could be 18 inches lower than the driveway.
Yes, oftentimes you are.
Okay, and that's why that we were speaking earlier about the rainwater dumping next to the house or overwatering. That's right on the wall of the foundation.
That's right.
Okay.
You know, so oftentimes we misunderstand the conditions as homeowners. We look superficially at the lawn or the driveway and we see a crack. We don't quite correlate it to the conditions that might be contributing to that, or to the conditions that are underneath the home. I really emphasize that you have to think about a home in 3 dimensions. And when you're looking at a landscaped yard, it looks beautiful, but you have to understand that the crawl space is probably 18 to 24 inches below that. It's like a big swimming pool under there.
Okay. Now, we have spoken in the past about the foundation. So when you drive by new construction, you will see them pour a foundation in a square, a rectangle, or something like that. And then in between those walls are the piers.
Yes.
And that's called a post and pier perimeter. What's the technical term for that type of foundation?
It's the interior piers are the concrete structures that we're talking about with wooden blocks over the top of them.
Right.
But we have a T-stem type footing under most homes, or a grade beam type foundation, 2 different components.
Right. They're a little easier. I know you draw a lot of pictures for your buyers and sellers and
Yes.
agents, okay? So that, by the way, that perimeter concrete wall goes into the ground an additional 2 feet or a foot
Sometimes
and a half?
as much as a couple of feet
Wow.
or more. Yeah.
Okay.
And then on the bottom of it has a large foot, so we call it a T-stem type foundation.
Perfect, okay. So that's why it's really something if you go into a crawl space and it's damp or wet or pulling water. Water in the exterior side of the building had to go all the way down and sponge back up and around and up?
That's correct.
Wow, okay.
And in those other instances where we have a pier and grade beam type foundation, then the pier is what holds the grade beam in place, but the grade beam floats like a cantilever bridge over a driveway, over a freeway, so that there is no contact or very little contact of the grade beam beyond the piers that hold it in place. And in those instances, there's no divider that would keep the water from the outside from getting into the crawl space.
Okay. So again, we have a picture for this. If you're looking at the wall, you're in the crawl space, you have the flashlight on the wall, and you can see evidence of water intrusion.
Yes.
Evaporating water and minerals on the walls. And then now let's go to the post and pier.
Sure.
The pier, which there be dozens of piers under your person's house holding it up, right?
Yeah. Oftentimes they're spread out throughout the crawl space 4 to 6 feet apart, depending on where the girder beams are. And on top of the concrete pier, we have wooden blocks that support the girder beams.
Okay, so for lack of a better term here, it looks like a checkerboard.
Yes.
Where they place the piers every 2 or 4 boxes, right? and then they have big beams going across, and then they start building their house.
Yes.
Okay. Now, so you're underneath, and you've noticed we have a picture of this where you can actually put your hand. You have your glove, your left hand, I believe, that's gloved, reaching down and going underneath the pier.
Yeah. So oftentimes these piers are not as deep as you would hope they would be, or as deep as the perimeter foundation. So they literally sit on top of this expansive soil. And when the soil gets wet, it expands to 20%, and it begins to heave and push these piers up. And the resulting sloping floors, cracks in the walls, sticking doors and things are what the homeowner will experience. And then they're looking at us for answers as to what's causing it.
I see. Okay, now let's talk about, let's go out just for a moment here. One of the realtors or an agent is waiting for you, and he looks up. You're in the crawl space underneath. He's waiting for you to finish your inspection. He looks up, and there's a crack in the hallway ceiling.
Sure.
All right, so we have a picture of that crack in the ceiling. Now let's go back down into the crawl space. And again, we are at the concrete pier. Above that is usually a 4x4 piece of wood.
4x6.
Or 4x6.
Yeah.
Okay, well, between the pier and the girder beam
Yes.
is the 4x4 post and pier going
Yes.
up, right?
Yes.
So again, the checkerboard, we have all the concrete piers, which sit in a little bed of concrete
Yes.
themselves, right? And then there's a 4x4 piece of wood going up 6, 10, 12 inches to the
Yes.
beam holding the house up. Now we have a picture of that where there's a crack in that piece of wood holding the house up.
Yeah.
How did that happen?
So imagine yourself as a piece of wood sitting on a concrete pier. When this pier pushes upward, it's lifting the whole house at that point. And the stresses on that piece of wood is tremendous.
And we'll say this is wintertime when it's wet and the ground's swelling up full of moisture.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now when summertime comes and it begins to shrink, the ground, it'll settle down a little bit, but it's already pushed up far enough that it'll never get back to its original condition. And so this pier is stressed to the max, and it begins to split apart. So you lose strength, you have a nail right through that cracked board, and that's where you lose your integrity of that pier.
Now also, we have another picture of this where you could just see, it looks like the pier or concrete pier is offset. It looks like it's leaning Tower of Pisa,
Sure.
so, right?
Sure.
Okay.
So you have a concrete block, a concrete pier, and a piece of wood that sits on it, and two little nails holding this pier post in place. If it doesn't crack, if it stays straight, that would be one scenario. But oftentimes it's set a little bit crooked, and as it begins to push up, it settles more and more out of shape.
Okay. And for anyone listening to the program, they could see this on YouTube or Create TV, right?
That's right.
Now, let's get into the house. We go back into the house, and you come out of the crawl space, and the agent says, "Hey, what's that crack all about in the hallway? We didn't see that when we made an offer."
Thank you for asking that, Pat. Perhaps you and I have talked about this too in front of our clients, but so oftentimes we'll see vertical cracks or horizontal cracks above a doorway or in the hallway. We don't necessarily get so concerned about those, but the diagonal cracks, the ones that begin to lift the hair on the back of your neck, you know that those are more or less stress related.
Okay.
And as a home inspector, we can discern where that stress came from, and that's where we begin to look to see whether the piers are heaving or lifting or settling, and whether there is actual cracking or settlement of the perimeter foundation. Those will give a big story as to what's happening with the home and what might need to be done.
Okay, because we have, in California, each agent has to walk the property and look for red flags.
Yes.
Oftentimes they see a crack in the ceiling and they say, normal crack in ceiling due to settling, which is really out of their league, to be
I think it
speaking
is.
about, right?
I think it is.
Okay.
Because every crack will probably get bigger. It's not going to get smaller. And whether it's related to a one-time event like an earthquake, or whether this was more nefarious like settlement issues or expansive soil conditions, needs a lot more determination.
Okay, let's go just for a moment. We go back and we say, let's say you noticed a crack in the perimeter, the wall of the crawl space. Two types of cracks, vertical and horizontal. Quickly, can you describe the difference?
Absolutely. Vertical cracks would be that where there's some force on the foundation, and it either caused it to separate at the top or separate at the bottom. But you can see that there is displacement or movement in the crack. Vertical cracks have, however, much less significance or concern to us as home inspectors than horizontal cracks. And so we're looking at one being the result of expansive soil or settlement issues or stress. The horizontal crack is another beast altogether, though.
Okay.
And
We've been down that road before.
yeah,
And that's the rebar
that's the rebar.
that's rotted out inside.
That's right. So sometimes the rebar is placed too close to the foundation surface, and if there's any cracking at all, it'll absorb some water, and water in steel causes it to expand, and there's no place for it to expand.
Once it rusts, it'll pop out.
It'll pop out.
And that could be replaced and fixed.
Yes,
That's when, in your report, you would say, seek professional foundation company.
absolutely.
Okay. Now, by the way, I noticed the pins on your lapel. Can you describe what those are quickly?
Sure. One of them is for ASHI, the American Society of Home Inspectors, and I've been a member and certified inspector for about 30 years now. The other is for the Real Estate Association that I belong to.
Okay, so that is, and you've done how many inspections so far?
I've lost track over the years,
Yeah,
Pat,
yeah.
but
Oh,
40
okay.
years is many thousands of homes.
Thousands, tens of thousands here. Okay, let's get into the sump pumps. We're back in the crawl space, so we've had this before. High water tables, sump pumps, things like that. We are around the San Francisco Bay. There are some homes that it's just, the neighbors just say, well, yeah, we always have water in our crawl space. That's why we have a sump pump. And one neighbor might have a sump pump, neighbor may not. Can you explain, what is a sump pump?
So a sump pump is a mechanically operated pump that turns on and off with a float device. It's plugged into a ground fault protection device underneath the home and set into a bucket of water. And if there's enough moisture underneath the home to accumulate in that bucket, then it'll begin to pump the water out through a tube to the exterior of the home.
Okay, high water tables, quickly.
Sure. When you live in an area, and we have some of these areas where they're wet all the time, summer and winter time, the water table is so high that it's right at the surface of the ground or a couple of feet below the ground. But in any case, when you think about a crawl space that's already 18 inches or 2 feet below the ground, you may be right at water table.
Okay, we had a situation years ago where homes were cut into the hills. A housing tract was cut into the hills, fancy neighborhood, and it's just like a staircase going up the hill.
Sure.
And because of that soil, water could just flow down the mountainside from one yard to another yard to another yard.
Exactly.
And we had a situation where I think you crawled out and you said, hey, there's on one corner of the house that you were muddy on one side.
Exactly.
We were all shocked. Now, let's get into that in terms of getting water away from the house. In that particular housing tract, I went to the other homes for sale, and there was a gentleman, he was an appraiser, he was working out of his home office, and I moved the Hoover vacuum cleaner and everything out. I opened the crawl space, and it was dry as a bone. And all the other homes in the neighborhood had moisture. And I said, sir, why is this happening? He said, I read the reports before I bought the house, before I built the house. And I asked for French drains. And I brought in, I think he said 5 truckloads or 5 yards, 5 yards or 5 truckloads of rock. Can you describe, why did that gentleman have dry crawl space versus everybody else that had a damp one?
Sure. So if you're imagining a hillside and you are at the bottom of the hillside 4 or 5 houses down, all the water that they're dumping from their downspouts or from their landscaping is running down underground to the next home, to the next home. You're the bottom of the pit. You're going to be collecting all that water into your crawl space area. Maybe not on the surface of the ground, but if you're 18 inches down below that, that's where the water is going to accumulate.
And how did he mitigate that with what's a French drain, and what's the deal with all the rock?
So he's circumvented the water that's coming down towards his house before it gets to the crawl space area by digging a deep trench. The trench has to be a certain distance away from the foundation. It has to be deep enough so that it's going to collect all the water before it gets to the foundation. And then in the bottom of that pit would be a perforated drain line. Sometimes the perforated drain lines are not properly installed. They're supposed to have the holes facing the downside.
Right.
And not on the upside.
Not on the upside.
And then there's a fabric cloth that goes over the top of that, and then all that rock that he purchased is put on top of that as well.
So it allows for all the water coming to the building to go into the trench, into the pipe with the holes in it, and drained away from the property.
That's correct.
Okay.
In some instances, it may not be possible to have a daylight drain where the water could physically drain away from that French drain, and so they would put it into a Christie box or a pump and pump the water out to the street.
Okay, now you're popping my bubble here with these attic fans. I'm a huge fan. I've never had an attic fan, but I know they work well in cooling the house down. What's the Home Inspectors of America? What are they?
So what we're finding is that in the envelope of the home, we wind up creating differential pressures as a result of attic fans. And when you put a negative pressure above the living space, it then begins to suck the air from the living space into the attic. In those instances where you have really wet crawl spaces, even with a sump pump, it stays wet, then you begin to suck that water from this crawl space up into the house, and then it goes from there up into the attic, into the outside. So you're drawing all that moisture from the crawl space into the living space.
Okay, now for the in layman's terms, an envelope of the house. Let's say that is the house with all the windows.
With the house walls.
House walls closed, maybe, and you crack the windows for the. Are you supposed to crack a couple of windows for the whole house fan?
Absolutely, it's required.
Okay, and then, but that's not enough air to be pulled out. Is that what you're saying? It's coming all the little holes in the floor.
That's right.
And we have all the cables and the vents and cracks and whatnot, so that's going to draw. Now, could that also be a mold issue? Could that create a mold issue, even though it's summertime?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we're all energy conservationists. So we install dual pane windows, we install new paint and insulation in older homes to make them more livable for us. But what that does is it impedes the moisture that would have traveled through the home to the outside easily, through the walls, through the leaky windows, and through the attic. And now it keeps it inside the house for a much longer period of time.
What about fans in the crawl space? We see that back east, right? Do we ever have, we have 2 minutes left, fans in the crawl space?
So what you're trying to do is improve the ventilation in a otherwise static or sub area. It does help move the air, but it doesn't necessarily dry the crawl space out. So there is a technique called clean space technology where they have a plastic envelope that encompasses the entire crawl space. When they do that, they make it an area that requires no more ventilation, and they close the air vents all the way around the home. And I know that sounds counterproductive to us because we're not used to a conditioned space, but that's exactly what they've created. And there's no longer any moisture coming into the crawl space or through the crawl sub area soil. They put a sump pump underneath that, and it seals that area. You could have all of your personal stored items underneath there, and it would stay bone dry.
Yeah, I started a Pinterest site of all the pictures of the crawl spaces there. Okay, with 1 minute remaining, do you have any advice for the buyers and sellers out there when they're shopping for a home for the crawl space? What are we looking for?
I think that as you walk through the home, you probably want to look to see if there are sloping floors, cracks in the walls. Look for drainage issues around the home. Make sure that the downspouts are properly terminated, that the ground slopes away from the home. If you see any evidence of abnormalities, cracks in the sidewalk, driveways, slabs, or sloping floors, you know that there's some issues that need to be attended to, and a good home inspection is your best answer.
Fantastic. Eric Chapman, thank you so much for coming out today.
You're welcome.
Thanks again for watching Powhatan Real Estate. This is a program dedicated to consumer protection within the residential real estate arena. If you're listening to this show, you can check it out on Create TV or on YouTube. Thanks again for watching. Take care. We will see you next week.